So thank you all. Thanks for coming in here. On behalf of Ideas Program, I welcome you all, people who are here in person and those who have joined us online. My name is Richa Chintan and I am a post coordinator here. And it's a real honor that Professor Utsa Patnaik is here to deliver the valedictory lecture. And she needs no introduction. In fact, we all have grown up listening to her and reading her. So thank you, ma'am, for joining us. And with this valedictory lecture, we sort of come to an end to our third year of the Ideas Advanced Certificate Program on Research in Political Economy. And I would also like to take this opportunity because as we go into the fourth year, I would like to request you to help us spread a word about the fourth year and invite more students to this family, Ideas family. And to take the proceedings further, I would like to request Professor Shakti Roy. He needs no introduction because he's been teaching the students here. The alumni and current batch knows him very well. He's been teaching here, mentoring students, and of course, guiding us.
So this is an honor for me. Of course, Professor Utsa Patnaik requires no introduction. But since we have an younger audience, I think that let me take the pleasure of formally introducing Professor Utsa Patnaik. She taught in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she was one of the few who returned from Cambridge to join the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in its formative days. Her immense contribution in the field of political economy is internationally acclaimed, particularly regarding the understanding of agrarian relations in India from a Marxian perspective. Her critical engagement and contribution to the mode of production debate, which perhaps continued for more than a decade. Analysis of India's agrarian relations, poverty question and the critique of the measurement, estimates of drain of wealth from India during the colonial rule, agrarian question during the neoliberal age and capitalism and imperialism in clearly history and present are well-known contributions to the field of political economy. She has, in a credit, more than 100 research papers published in reputed journals and edited volumes, and large number of books, including Themes of Servitude, Bondage and Slavery in India, Agrarian Relations and Accumulation, the Mode of Production Debate in India, the Agrarian Question in Marx and its Successors, the Republic of Commerce and Other Essays, the Long Transition Essays on Political Economy, the Agrarian Question in the Neoliberal Era, Primitive Accumulation and the Peasantry, with Sam Mono and Utsa, the Making of History, Cases Presented in Infancy, a Theory of Imperialism and Categorical Imperialism in India, Theory, History and Present with Prof. Patnaik. Now, some of these books are already being discussed in our political economic development lectures. And I think that in the end semester assignment, students are given to write reviews of one of the latest books also. So,
which one?
Oh,
okay.
So, I request Professor Patnaik to deliver the lecture, and some contentious issues in classical political economy and their implications for the present.
You need to speak into the mic?
No, you can.
It's pretty warm here. Can we have something on AC or it's on? Okay. Thank you very much for your very generous introduction. When a couple of years ago, I was asked by the organizers of the advanced certificate course to give some lectures for the coursework itself, I said, no, please excuse me. And the reason was that, over the last, how many years now? I suppose more than 60 years of studying and teaching economics, at the end of it, I confess to being somewhat disillusioned with the subject because I find that a great many of the propositions of classical political economy, on which, of course, the modern exposition of economic theory is also based, really suffer from very severe logical problems, factual as well as logical mistakes. And I thought that if I give lectures, there'll be critiques, but the critique should be given only to people who have already studied economics in depth for a number of years. So why, as it were, burden students with my disillusionment? Let them learn the economics first, and then perhaps they can get on to the critique. At least that is the way I thought. But since I was asked to give a valedictory lecture, not a course of lectures in the regular coursework, I thought, okay, why not? Let me plunge in anyway, even though it may prove disillusioning for some of you. Now, the project that I have been engaged with, along with a number of other colleagues, not only in India, but abroad as well, is uncovering what we call the true history of the rise of industrial capitalism and the resulting retrogression in the societies of the South that became in the past colonies of conquest of the West European nations. In our view, the factual basis of this history has been obfuscated, in fact, quite deliberately so in most cases, in the literature, and the theoretical basis of the existing literature is logically highly suspect. In other words, I find a great many fallacies in the existing theoretical literature. What do we know mean by fallacy, and what are the types of fallacies? Now, a fallacy is not simply something which arises from ignorance or ineptitude in thinking, but it arises from a faulty mode of reasoning. Just as one cannot learn to ride a bike without falling off once or twice. In other words, it doesn't come naturally to you to ride a bicycle. Similarly, thinking logically is not something that comes naturally to people. It is something which has to be learned. Now, the interesting thing is that there was no discipline, separate discipline called economics, just over a century ago. Even John Maynard Keynes had not studied economics as such. What he had studied was mathematics and, to some extent, philosophy. And the precursors of John Maynard Keynes, the classical economists, were, of course, very well versed in philosophy and history before they went on to write on what they call political economy. But they started with philosophy and with history. Okay. Adam Smith, as you know, was extremely well read both in philosophy and history, and so was Karl Marx. What they studied was what they call moral philosophy, as well as history. Karl Marx wrote a doctoral thesis in philosophy on Democritus and Epicurus before undertaking his magnum opus, the study of capitalism in Das Kapital. However, the only exception by his own admission was David Ricardo. He was a stockbroker by profession, not an academic, extremely clever, but he modestly admitted to having studied neither philosophy nor history. And the fact that his modesty was not misplaced, that he was justified in his modesty, I think becomes very evident when one reads with a critical eye Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Because despite his great cleverness in the area of formal logic, he could not avoid committing simple errors in applied logic. Now, what is this distinction between formal logic and applied law? Unfortunately, students of economics for many, many decades have not been required to study philosophy at all, which I think is a very big mistake. And I would request all of you to look at books on philosophy and particularly books on logic. Start with elementary books and go on to more difficult ones. Because logic is a subject which has to be studied by those who practice any discipline at all. No discipline can advance if arguments are not logical. Now, most economists today, when you ask them what is logic, will think in terms of formal logic alone. That is, in terms of mathematics. But formal logic is only one part of logic. The other part of logic is what logicians call applied logic. Formal logic, if you like, has to do with entities which have no empirical content, and mathematics typically is that. A mathematician works with symbols, and there is no empirical content to those symbols. So he is dealing really with the interrelationships, the logical interrelationships with symbols, entities which have no empirical content as such. So that is pure formal logic. But economics is not a subject devoted only to formal logic. It is about the real world. And if you are studying economics, you need to also know applied logic. So logicians make the following kind of distinction to simplify and to give it in very briefly. They distinguish between material fallacies, that is, incorrect arguments which arise from incorrect statement of fact. And the term material is suggestive of that. Because material fallacies have to do with the material world around us. So you have to have knowledge of the material world. If you start with an incorrect statement of fact in your argument, then the inference you draw will be wrong. They distinguish material fallacies from logical fallacies. And they divide logical fallacies into two parts. One part of logical fallacy is verbal fallacy. The other part is what I've already talked about, formal fallacy. So verbal fallacies arise from the incorrect use of terms, and formal fallacies arise from an incorrect process of inference. Okay. Now, most economists don't understand that the correct use of terms is a part of logic. In fact, the very word logic derives from logos or discourse, the Greek term. Okay. So in discourse, when we are arguing or putting forward an argument, it is very important to have a very precise idea and very precise use of terms. If you use terms loosely, or if you skip from one meaning of a term to another meaning of a term, of the same term in the course of an argument, your inference will be wrong. Now, I wish I had been asked to study logic when I was a student. I was not. And I'm sure none of you have ever been asked to study logic either. So please start now. I only started at a very advanced age of almost 50 because my son chose not to do economics, but to do philosophy. So he had his philosophy books lying around at home. And that's when I started turning over some pages. I said, look at that. I knew such and such argument was wrong, but I didn't know how to put it. But it's all there. I mean, it's all codified and laid out 2000 years ago. What exactly is wrong with the argument that I've been feeling instinctively is wrong, but I've not been able to formulate where exactly it's wrong. Now, why do I think that most of modern day economics is not soundly based on logical arguments? It's not very surprising because decades ago, Kathleen Guff had argued in an article in Monthly Review that anthropology is the child of imperialism. The discipline did not exist before you had imperialism or colonialism, let us say. That is the violent external expansion of a handful of West European countries across the globe. And a project of creating colonies of conquest, mainly located in tropical areas. The only colony of conquest which you find in the temperate area, temperate climatic area is what? Ireland, right? But otherwise, all colonies of conquest were in tropical areas. So if anthropology is the child of imperialism, as Kathleen Gough had argued, even more so was economics or political economy the child of imperialism. Because it is these theories developed precisely during the period when there was this violent external expansion of the Western European countries. And the basic, groundwork of political economy was laid in Britain, which was the first industrializing nation and which ended up with the largest colonial empire of any European country, before or since. All right. Now, perhaps some of you have already read my paper called Ricardo's Fallacy. I don't know how many of you have gone through it, but I'm not aware that anybody has reviewed it favorably to date, though it was published 20 years ago. Okay. So what exactly is the fallacy in Ricardo's argument? Of course, in the course of critiquing classical political economy or their theories, one also developed an alternative theoretical understanding of the reason for colonialism and imperialism, which is, I think, very soundly based in material reality, which has been ignored completely in the economic literature. And that is the fact that when you ask the basic question, why is it that a handful of European nations felt the need at all to embark on very long, dangerous, and expensive voyages? Why did they feel the need to introduce trade at gunpoint in areas where people had been trading for centuries peacefully? Why did they feel the need to actually establish colonies of conquest? They actually militarily, navally conquered certain areas of the world and started ruling them. What is the basic reason? You won't find an answer in any of the traditional literature, other than the idea, well, the Europeans were extremely energetic, innovative, adventurous, etc., kind of cultural factors. But the argument that we put forward in our book on theories of a theory of imperialism, and the later one, Capital and Imperialism, is based on the idea that, look, there is a basic asymmetry in resource endowments between the cold temperate north, where the West European countries are based, and where today countries like the United States, Canada are also based in the cold temperate areas of the world. The basic productive asymmetry between those regions and the tropical areas of the world, in that the tropical areas are far more richly endowed in terms of primary resources. And the cold temperate areas are very poorly endowed. They're very poor in terms of resources. This may appear strange to you because we are used to thinking of countries like Germany, UK, USA as being rich, and countries like, in the Caribbean or Thailand or India, or of course the African countries as being poor. But in fact, they were not poor to begin with. Nor were the European countries and North Americans rich to begin with. They started off at a point where some of the economic historians, like Angus Madison, have said that they started off more or less on an equal footing. But I think even Madison is wrong there. They started off on a footing where the Europeans were actually much worse off than the Asians were, because their resource endowments were so poor. Now, primary resources are absolutely vital for survival, because everything depends on our primary sector resources. We not only get our food from the land, we get our fibers for clothing, we get our building materials, we get energy for transport and for cultivation. In the past, the energy was provided by food grains, which also doubled as feed grains, which were fed to horses and oxen for drawing plows, for drawing carts, and so on. So the primary sector provides everything. Now, if you live in an area in the cold temperate region which produces only one crop a year, because all through 6 months of the year, the ground is frozen, nothing will grow. So it's a single crop economy per force. And even the food trains in the medieval period, there was what um, Leo Huberman called an atrocious competition between humans and animals because there was just not enough grain to carry both human populations and animal population through the cold winter months. So animals had to be slaughtered in order that there was enough food left over for the humans in terms of grain, and also of course, the flesh of the animals was also consumed all through the winter. And we mentioned the fact that I dug up in a theory of imperialism, which of course your modern textbooks will never mention, that although they were rare, there were even cases of community cannibalism in Europe in the late medieval period, because when you had harvests failing year after year after year, there was just not enough food. The animals were slaughtered, but there was not even food even to carry the human population. It was very rare, but it did happen. It is mentioned in the Chronicles. It is mentioned in B.H. Slicker Van Barth's book on the agrarian history of Western Europe, which I quote in a theory of imperialism. And even to this day, the poverty of primary sector resources is a fact. It is a mode of production transcending fact. That it was true in feudal times, it was true under capitalism, it will remain true for at least another century to come. Because global warming is not going so fast that the cold temperate areas are going to be able to produce tropical crops. So countries like ours can produce not only everything that Germany or the United States or the UK can produce. In addition, we can produce a range of tropical and subtropical crops, which for climatic reasons can never be produced in the northern countries. They could not be produced in the past. Their output was zero. They cannot be produced today. Today, the output is zero there. How much sugarcane can Germany produce or Canada produce? Zero. No matter how much capital they put in. Okay, so regardless of how much capital you put in, output is going to be zero. How much coffee can the US produce? I believe there's a tiny amount it is producing somewhere in the Southern California in a particular little climatic zone. But the millions of tons of coffee it consumes every year, every bean has to be imported. So there's an enormous range of crops which could only be produced in our lands. And that is a very major reason for the external expansionism of the European countries. And it is a very major reason if you look at the way that the WTO has been used in modern times by the US and the European countries, why they will simply not get off the backs of developing countries. Because our agriculture and its biodiversity is absolutely essential. Access to it is absolutely essential for underpinning the high living standards of European and North American populations today. If you took away the products that they import from us, then their standard of living would plummet. They would have plenty of grain, bread, they would have plenty of dairy products. In fact, they produce huge mountains and surpluses of these products. But they would not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables in winter. They would not have access to the tropical beverages like tea and coffee. They would not have sufficient access to cotton, raw cotton for producing clothing, and so on. Now, strangely enough, even though this is such a blatant material reality, it does not figure anywhere in economic theory. Not even in Marxist economic theory, which is meant to be the materialist interpretation of history, which is a very big shortcoming. But of course, the reason partly, I think, lies in the fact that Ricardo came before Marx, and Ricardo really muddied the conceptual waters very considerably with his theory of trade. Now, I have been talking about fallacies in two parts of Ricardo's theory, not only his theory of trade, but also his theory of rent. It's very hot still. Can't you do something about that's not on. That one is not on. Is it on? Put the fan on then, please. Maybe because I'm talking, I'm feeling pretty warm. Yeah. Can you put at a low speed? Will it interfere with the sound a little? Huh? Yeah. Now, you see, most people don't understand that there are two distinct theories of rent. The theory that Ricardo put forward, and before him, the theory that Adam Smith put forward, and which Marx took over in substantial part. And the essential difference between the two is that in Adam Smith, the category of rent is firmly tied to the question of ownership. And that is common sense. Why is it that somebody can demand rent from me if I want to cultivate land? Because that person owns that land, has property right in that land. Why is it that if I want a place to live, I have to pay a rent to the house owner? Why? Because he's the house owner. He owns the property. So by the mere fact of ownership, he can charge rent. Now, in the case of agricultural rent, you see, this is a very, very revolutionary and subversive concept, that rent is the result of property right. Because, unlike a capitalist, somebody who has inherited land has done nothing to deserve that inheritance. Maybe his forefathers worked very hard to make that land cultivable and got ownership right over it. But if you have inherited land, then you have not done anything to deserve an income from that land. You have not put in any effort, you have not put in any investment. So the classical economists like Adam Smith were firmly opposed to the idea of rent as an income category because they thought of it as a parasitic income. And if you read Adam Smith, he's very clear on that, like all men, the moment land becomes private property, the owner loves to charge a rent, even though he has not put in any capital in it himself. But Ricardo's theory of rent is completely different. It has nothing to do with ownership at all. He changed the definition of rent without realizing he was changing the definition, perhaps. But this is called the fallacy of equivocation. The term rent is now being used in two different senses. Adam Smith's sense, which Marx took over and called absolute ground rent, which is a return to the ownership, property ownership, and Ricardo's idea, which has nothing to do with property ownership, which is simply surplus profit, profit which arises over and above normal rate of profit, because the land you have happens to be of higher fertility, or it happens to have a better location. Therefore, you can get a surplus profit, and that is what he calls rent. And it has nothing to do with property ownership at all. So even if you have socialized production, nobody owns the land, and land is collectively owned, you would still have rent in Ricardo's sense. And that is the sense of rent that modern theory, economic theory, has taken over. And it means that they have completely divested the concept of any kind of social or revolutionary content. Because you see, most revolutions in the last 100 years have been anti-feudal revolutions, or they started as anti-feudal revolution, then went on to become proletarian revolutions. That is, they started as the struggle of people who were being exploited through high rates of rent extraction from them, even though they were the people who were putting in all the labor, all the investment in cultivating, but a large part of their product, either in kind or cash, was being taken away by the landowner purely by virtue of ownership right. So this anti-feudal struggle provided the engine for revolution. Whether you look at China, historically, of course, peasant revolutions have been very important in China, or whether you look at the Bolshevik revolution, which really got nowhere until it created the Worker-Peasant Alliance, which started with the 1905 revolution, the first revolution, and then culminated in the October Revolution, 1970. Now, this is where Ricardo's theory plays a kind of, I would say, apologetic role. That is, it does not provide you with a critique of feudal rent, does not provide you with any kind of economic ammunition to use against feudal landowners at all, because he has changed the concept completely. And modern textbooks, have you ever come across that? Any exposition in any modern economics textbook of either Adam Smith's theory of rent or Marx's theory of rent? I don't think so. I don't think a single modern textbook will even mention either Adam Smith or Ricardo. So what modern theory does is it jettisons theories which are right, which are correct, which are logically soundly based, and it picks up the theories which provide a justification for property. Okay, and Ricardo's theory of rent being picked up like this is very indicative of it. Or you look at Ricardo's theory of trade, the famous theory of comparative advantage, which of course is in every textbook and which you learn as students. Now, the problem is that is based on a material fallacy, an incorrect statement of fact, supported by a verbal fallacy, incorrect use of terms. Because what is the assumption that you need for Ricardo's famous example to be true, where he has the transformation frontier between cloth and wine for Portugal and England? You remember his famous example. What is the assumption you need? The assumption you need is that both countries can produce both goods. Otherwise, you cannot even define cost of production, leave alone relative cost of production. But that assumption is not true. For the major part of global trade, and about 70 to 80% of global trade, all through the 19th century, was trade in commodities, which primary commodities is what we are talking about, not manufacturers. Primary commodities were commodities which the temperate lands could not produce at all. That is the Northern Europe and North America. By the way, Latin European countries, Spain, Italy, etc., have a better endowment than cold temperate because they are classified as warm temperate lands. But even the Latin American countries, Latin European countries, produce only one crop a year. And that is the reason why, and that is true to this day, that India produces more cereals, a higher output of cereals in the latest figures I have for 2019 than all 27 countries of the European Union put together. And the 27 countries now also include countries like Turkey and so on. And that is not because our productivity in individual crops is necessarily higher, but because of double cropping and triple cropping. That is, the same plot of land can produce two crops in most areas, and in very favored areas, up to three crops over a year. Whereas in cold temperate land, a given plot of land can produce only one crop. That is all. Okay. So this assumption that Ricardo makes, both countries can produce both goods. In fact, the implicit assumption he makes is that all countries can produce all goods. That assumption is not true. It embodies a material fallacy, an incorrect statement of fact. All right. Now, the interesting thing is that that Ricardo, as it were, uses very peculiar terms to make this assumption when he's talking about England and Portugal. He says that suppose that England were to discover, I'm quoting now, I've written down the quote, which is there in my original paper. Suppose that England were to discover a process for making wine so that it should be in her interest to grow it rather than import it. She would naturally divert a portion of her capital from the foreign trade to the home trade. She would cease to manufacture cloth for exportation and would grow wine for herself. So, Ricardo is saying at the moment, England produces cloth more cheaply at a comparatively lower cost than Portugal. Therefore, England is exporting cloth and importing Portuguese wine. But supposing it became the case that England was to discover a process for making wine so that it should be in her interest to grow it rather than import it, you could have a reversal. England would then, as he says, grow all the wine and import all the cloth from Portugal. Now, there's a very strange term, grow wine. You see, this is a verbal fallacy, an incorrect use of terms. Nobody can grow wine. There are two different processes. You grow grapes and then you process the grapes into wine. Growing wine is the same as saying growing cloth or growing shoes. Now, this is not just a slip of the pen. It's not just a slip of the tongue. It is a verbal fallacy in Ricardo. He was a very clever man. He is considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern economics. You are taught his theories in textbooks, his theory of rent, his theory of trade. So why does he use such a peculiar phrase? And it's not as though he's an Indian who doesn't know English or doesn't know enough English. Ricardo's forefathers came from the Netherlands, but he had been born and brought up in England. He was an Englishman. So it's not that he didn't know the English language. Now, what I have suggested in my paper is that this is very interesting because conceptually what Ricardo is doing is that he is collapsing together two completely different processes. The act of growing the raw material and the act of processing it into something else. Now, in order to produce shoes, you have to first get the leather, which is the raw material for the shoes, and then make shoes out of it. In order to produce cotton cloth, you have to first get the raw material and then process that, the raw cotton, into cotton cloth. So there are two distinct processes. What he's doing, he's collapsing the two together, as though there's no distinction between the two. And why is he doing it? Because England could not produce grapes. By the way, now England can produce a little bit of grapes in the Thames Valley because they have now genetic modification of the grape vine. But when Ricardo was writing, for climatic reasons, England could not produce grapes. The river valleys in France could, the river valleys in Germany could. You need very specific climatic and soil conditions. The mean July temperature has to be at least 19 degrees centigrade, that is 66 degrees Fahrenheit, for grapes to be grown. And that is a condition England did not satisfy. It still doesn't satisfy it, except in a tiny area in the Thames Valley. So Ricardo is making a mistake here. Now, the interesting thing is that later economists like Samuelson, who discusses Ricardo's theory, have you read Samuelson's article called Market Mechanisms and Maximization? No? You should read it. Samuelson, Market Mechanism and Maximization. It's in the collected works of Paul A. Samuelson. Do a Google search, you'll probably find the exact reference. All right. Market Mechanism and Maximization. So there Samuelson is basically discussing linear programming methods and so on. And since Ricardo's transformation frontier is a linear transformation frontier between two commodities, he naturally treats it in those terms. Now, it's very interesting. He draws a diagram. He's talking about Ricardo's theory. But he doesn't give Ricardo's example. He puts on one axis crop, and on the other axis, he doesn't put wine. He puts food. And later on in his elementary textbook, Samuelson's Economics, which all of you must have read, you find the same thing. Without any discussion, he alters Ricardo's example. Okay, so he has spotted the problem, the fact that England could not produce grapes, and therefore, you don't have a transformation frontier when you can't produce the raw material. But he substitutes food there without discussing it. That's not an honest thing to do. If you're interfering, and who's he to interfere with Ricardo's example? If you are interfering with it, at least be honest with your students and readers. Tell them why you're doing it. He knows why he's doing it, but he's not telling you. He's quietly trying to paper over the logical problem with Ricardo. So what I'm saying is Ricardo starts with a material fallacy, an incorrect statement of fact. Both countries produce both goods. Then he supports this by a verbal fallacy, an incorrect use of terms, that is grow wine, which is an absurd thing in itself. Nobody can grow wine. And ultimately what you get is a theory, which is a fallacy which logicians call the converse of the fallacy of accident. What is the fallacy of accident? A fallacy of accident is when you make a very general assumption, but you improperly apply it to a case where the general assumption is not satisfied. Supposing you make a general assumption, all persons can see. Homer is a person. Homer, the great Greek dramatist, poet, not Homer, the cartoon character, all right? There's a cartoon character also called Homer. So all persons can see. Homer is a person, therefore Homer can see. Now, Homer was blind. Homer could not see. So the inference that Homer could see is wrong because you start with a general proposition, but you apply it improperly to a special case. But the converse of the fallacy of accident is the reverse of this. You can look up any elementary book on logic. Copy's logic will give you the converse of the fallacy of accident. Sometimes they call it converse fallacy of accident or fallacy of converse accident terminology. Converse is when you start with a very special assumption, but then the inference you draw is applied to a case where that special assumption does not hold. Now, Ricardo is starting with a very special assumption. Both countries produce both goods. And then what he does implicitly and what all economists have done subsequently is to improperly apply that his inference. What is his inference? His inference is that if countries specialize in accordance with their comparative cost advantage, then both countries will benefit in terms of a higher output of at least one of the goods without a lower output of the other. Okay, that is mutual benefit from trade if you specialize and change your production structure in accordance with comparative cost advantage. So mutual benefit from trade is a phenomenally important inference, because then your economics textbook says, well, the colonized countries did not know it. That's why they were against being colonized, but they benefited, as Ricardo has told us. There is a mutual benefit from specialization and trade. Now, this is a wrong inference, because what you're doing is the inference of mutual benefit can only follow provided the assumption is satisfied, which is that you can define comparative cost advantage. In the case of colonial trade, which involved tropical commodities, which could not be produced at all in the colonizing countries of the metropolis, you cannot even define the cost of production of the goods they imported, like rice or cane sugar or raw cotton, raw jute, indigo. There's an enormous list of products that they imported because they could not produce even an iota of it in their own countries. So the cost of production cannot be defined. What is the cost of production in Germany of cane sugar? There's zero output. You can't define the cost of production. Similarly, for all these goods in cold temperate Europe and North America. So the entire basis of Ricardian comparative cost advantage theory is logically incorrect. And it has served an apologetic function, because then you say that, okay, there was colonial trade and there was this and that, and bad things happened in the colonies. But in the long run, it was beneficial. That is the conclusion that is drawn, and it is an incorrect conclusion. So when you come to Adam Smith again, it's again very interesting. But before I leave Ricardo and this whole business of some crops not being grown at all in some areas, there's quite a recent book called The Empire of Cotton, A New History of Global Capitalism by Sven Deckert. He's a professor at Harvard, I think. Now, it's a very fat book, a very detailed research. From the style of writing, I don't think he has a formal economics training at all. He's an economic historian. And I was reading it with quite a lot of interest, but I stopped reading the moment I came across a sentence which said that if Britain had not imported cotton from the slave-run plantations in the Caribbean, or from slave-run plantations in the US, or from India and Egypt and so on, it would have had to devote some 2.5% of its land area to producing cotton. Now, England can't produce cotton. It's impossible, you know. So I said that, look, it's good. It's very good that there's such a detailed history. But, the subtitle should be not a new history of global capitalism, but a somewhat misleading history of global capitalism, because you are actually ignoring the basic fact. The other thing is that is ignored in the whole of economic literature is the fact that the colonies of conquest were conquered precisely because the colonizing countries from the metropolis, that is the West European countries, were not in a position to pay for what they wanted to import. There was simply no demand for their products. The Emperor of China, in a letter to George III, who had sent an embassy for setting up some kind of concession, wrote that, look, China has everything it needs. It does not need to import from you or from any other European country. We produce all our requirements in great profusion. But since you cannot do without our porcelain, you cannot do without our silk, you cannot do without our tea, therefore, as a great mark of favor, we will allow you to set up trading post in Canton. That was a mistake, because that was the beginning of the penetration of China's conversion into a semi-colony, just as the Mughal emperor had made a mistake in giving Clive the Diwani of Bengal. So similarly, China also fell into that trap. But the Europeans would not take no for an answer. And if you said no, then they sent their gunships, they blew open your ports with violence. There is a mistake in the Communist Manifesto. Now, the Communist Manifesto appeared in 1948 when Marx had just come to England. He was only 30 years old because he was born in, not in, what am I saying, in 1848. So Marx was born in 1818, so he was only 30 years old. Engels was a couple of years younger. Engels was only 28 years old. At that age, they had not had the opportunity of reading much about the real economic history of colonization. So what they write in the Communist Manifesto is that the ports were forcibly opened by the heavy artillery of the low cost of production of English textiles. Not at all. Chinese ports were forcibly opened with guns. There's no question of low cost of Lancashire textiles. The Chinese didn't want Lancashire. They produced plenty of cotton clothing at a very much lower cost than England did. They produced silk, which the Europeans and North Americans could not produce at all in the same quality or quantity as the Chinese did. It was the desire of the colonizers to get hold of tropical commodities, manufactures at that point of time, that led to their forcibly opening up the Chinese ports. But you see, you must remember that all the economists I'm talking about, and later on, you don't find this kind of language in Marx and Engels. By the time they start studying economics, political economy seriously, because up to that point they had not. And by the time they read on the actual process of colonization, they begin to realize that what the true state of affairs was. But even in Marx and Engels, you find no awareness whatsoever of this asymmetry of production capacities that I'm talking about. You don't find it anywhere in the traditional Marxist literature. You have to remember that all the people I'm talking about, whether it is Adam Smith or David Ricardo or Karl Marx or John Maynard Keynes, were in a sense extremely insular. They have never gone beyond the boundaries of Europe. They have never seen a palm tree in their lives. When I'll tell you an anecdote, as a child, my father was posted in London for about 4 years. I went there when I was about almost 9 years old, and I was there till I was almost 13. And she used to bring me those children's comics to read. And they would show palm trees, and the artist would draw the palm tree, the coconut palm, and he would show the coconut as a little hard, round, brown ball hanging from the tree. In other words, the coconut was shown the way that imported coconuts were there in the shops in London. The fact that you have green coconuts hanging from a tree is something in a country in the 1950s. I went there when it was 1954. That's how old I am. So that is what, 54. You can imagine how long ago that is. I think it's more than 60 years ago, right? 70 years ago. Yeah. So even though they had colonized tropical areas for 200 years, they didn't know what a green coconut, the artists didn't know what a green coconut looked like, right? But by the time you come to the modern era where people are traveling all over the globe, I'm sure Sven Descartes must have traveled to tropical areas. By then, the hold of the theories on your mind is so strong that you see the reality, but you do not perceive it. We see with our eyes, but we perceive with our mind. That is, you do not question the theories that you have grown up with. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I'm afraid this whole range, there are so many problems, there are so many fallacies in so many books that it is just not possible for me. I've got my water to, and they're all very interesting to cover even a fraction of them. But the other very important area that Adam Smith glosses over, that Ricardo glosses over, they don't talk about it, even though it was happening during their own lifetimes, is the mercantilist discrimination against India and Persia as far as imports of cotton clothing, cotton fabrics was concerned. Now, the best book on the Industrial Revolution in Britain is what I used to teach students when I was still teaching in JE, and that is by a Frenchman, not by any English person or any Anglo-Saxon person who has migrated to American university who writes an Industrial Revolution, but a Frenchman called Paul Martout, Mantaux, The Industrial Revolution in the 18th Century, which is a very detailed, very scholarly account. And it appeared first, I think, in 1913, though it was translated from the French later on, about 20 years later. That is absolutely a foundational book on the English Industrial Revolution. Monty has gone through all the parliamentary papers, he's gone through every report that came out in the 17th and 18th century, gives it all in footnotes. And he says that in 1700, because of the woolen industry feared competition from imports of Indian and Persian cotton fabrics, the East India Company was carrying out that trade from 1600 onwards, importing Indian and Persian cotton fabrics, printed and so on, all those calicos, muslins, the carpets, all the rest of it. It had been carrying that on for a whole century, from 1600 to 1700. By 1700, people in England had started using imported cotton fabrics in such large quantities that the woolen industry got worried. They said that our market is being eaten into. And they got Parliament to pass a law banning the use of imported cotton textiles, pure cotton textiles from India and Persia. Complete ban. The East India Company was allowed to bring in the cotton cloth, but it had to be warehoused in English ports and then be re-exported. They could re-export to the European continent, they could re-export to Caribbean, to North America, wherever they wanted, but they could not sell it within England. Now, smuggling continued. If you read Jane Austen, you will find Mrs. Bennet saying that so-and-so does not know where the best warehouses are. So people would go to the warehouse and, clandestinely buy Indian muslins for all those lovely dresses that the Austen heroines wear when you look at the serials on television or you look at the films. They were all imported. So in 1821, sorry, what am I saying? In 1721, there was an amendment to the law which said that ordinary citizens had to pay a £5 fine if they were found wearing imported cotton, and merchants who dealt in the banned imported cottons had to pay a fine of £21. Now, the per capita national income in Britain at that time was £7. So a £5 fine on an individual is like, today if you're charged 50,000 rupees. And there was direct action. That is the woolen, people who wove woolen cloth in England or span wool. If they saw you wearing muslin in the street, they would come and attack you and tear it off your back, the clothing off your back. They were engaged in direct action also. Now, until 1774, that is 3/4 of a century, this ban was in operation. So the English innovators who tried to imitate the banned textiles, they had 74 years in which to develop their machine. The Hargreaves spinning jenny, the various other innovations that you hear about. 74 long years. It has taken 70 years after independence, and the diffusion of technology is very fast nowadays. It has taken 70 years after independence for us to develop our own capacity for landing people, for sending satellites into space. In fact, ISRO actually hires out its services to other countries which don't have a space organization, as you know. But it took 74 years for the English to learn how to weave, how to first spin a yarn which was fine enough to compete with Indian yarn, and to weave cloth which was fine enough to compete with the muslins. And even after the ban was lifted, because Arkwright petitioned Parliament and said that, look, now we can produce this cloth ourselves. There's no point in banning their consumption because we are producing it within the country. So the ban on consumption was lifted, but the ban on use of Indian and Persian textiles remained in the form of very high tariffs, which were raised further. Even after the first phase of Industrial Revolution was over, the ban on certain types of Indian fabrics was raised from 15% to more than 70% by 1830. And by then, the first phase of the factory Industrial Revolution was already done. So until 1846, the English market was protected for the best period of 150 years. I think no market has ever been protected for that long. If you read the historians of the Industrial Revolution, the well-known names, Dean and Cole, Eric Hobsbawm said, whoever says Industrial Revolution says cotton. Okay? If you read David Lance, The Unbound Prometheus, whose entire book is about innovations in textile machinery, which finally led to factory production rising in Britain. Not a single one of them mentions the period of protection, this long period of protection, not a single one. According to them, innovations happened because the English were innovative. It's a kind of circular reasoning. The protection of the domestic market has no role to play. They simply ignore it. Lance does not give a single reference to Mantu. Hobsbawm does not give a single reference to Mantu. Dean and Cole do not give a single reference to Mantu. And now I find that Sven Beckert does not give a single reference to Mantu either. And what is more, he says the following. In retrospect, late 18th century England seemed ripe for a reinvention of cotton manufacturing. British capitalists look back on 2 centuries of cotton textile production. Incorrect statement of fact. There was no pure cotton textile produced in England for 2 centuries before the late 18th century. What they produced was a mixture of linen and imported cotton, which is called fustian. They could not produce pure cotton because they lacked the skill to do so. So incorrect statement of fact, and no reference to Mantu, no reference to the actual basic data, the parliamentary reports, the various other reports, which talk about the inability of England to produce fine cottons. Yeah, had access to investable capital. Also, British textile producers based in households had withstood the pressure of imports from India for decades, an experience that schooled them in the importance of being able to compete with Indian manufacturing. But there was no competition. because the Indian manufacturers had been banned. They were not allowed to enter the British market for 74 years. Incorrect statement of fact again. I mean, it is really quite shocking. But it is not just Sven Brickert, it is also Indian authors who are so completely hegemonized by this incorrect economic history. Because what the basic thrust of the argument is very simple. The thrust of the argument is that foreign trade in colonies had nothing to do with industrial revolution in Britain. It has nothing to do with industrialization spreading to the rest of Europe. It was all a result of the internal dynamic of the system. So external trade had, okay, it had something to do with it, but very little. It was not decisive. And there are two economists based in the US who have written 3-volume textbook. The first wrote a 2-volume textbook way back when I was a student in the late 1960s. Floud and McCloskey, The Economic History of England since 1700. Now those textbooks have been expanded into 3 volumes. Many more authors have come in, etc. Roderick Floud and Donald McCloskey are the major editors. And Donald McCloskey later had a sex change and became Deirdre McCloskey, changed into a woman. So I have to refer to D. McCloskey as they. That's the correct term, I'm told, if you have a sex change. So there's a subsequent article, much more recent in the 1990s, by Nick Harley, C. Harley, and Deirdre McCloskey, which is about English foreign trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, in which they are explicitly countering the idea that colonial trade or foreign trade generally had anything to do with industrialization in England. And they said that, okay, England did import some raw materials, but if the colonies had not been there, if the imports could not take place from the colonies, it would have produced those materials within England, admittedly at a higher cost. Again, an incorrect statement of fact. Can you imagine England producing? Have any of you been to England? I mean, I'm not talking about the online participants, but have any of you stayed in England here within the participants here? No. Well, I have spent 10 years of my life living in England, 4 years going to school there, later on 6 years in university, both at Oxford and Cambridge. And let me tell you that the idea of England growing raw cotton or growing sugarcane or growing coffee is mind-boggling. You know, it is completely impossible. In fact, England could not even grow enough grain to feed its own population. It colonized Ireland in order to import grain and animal products to feed its own growing urban population. That's another story which I've written in an article on the so-called on the agricultural revolution in England, which was not really a revolution at all, because per capita grain output declined in England during the 18th century, during the period that it was actually undergoing that revolution. So the current literature is full of straightforward material fallacy. Material fallacy is incorrect statement of fact. It's straightforward, ignoring of all the evidence. It is full of verbal fallacies, incorrect use of terms, and it is also contains formal fallacies as well, which I had no time to go into here because I think I've already taken about 1 hour of your time since I started talking. And the field is absolutely vast. So I'll end with the classical economists again. Marx, of course, was brilliant, but his life was too short. When you read Marx's, I'll take just another 2 minutes and then I'll stop. When you read Marx's program that he set out of what he intended to do when he started studying political economy, and that is in his preface to an introduction to the critique of political economy, which was published in 1859. He says, first, I will discuss, wages of labor, profit of capital, rent of land, the 3 great categories in economics. Then I will go on to discuss foreign trade, the state, foreign trade, and the world market. So he intended there to be not 3, but 6 volumes of Capital. The last 3 volumes were to be devoted to the state, foreign trade, and the global market. Oh, I'm paraphrasing here. The exact words I don't remember exactly, but that is the idea. But of course, he never got around to the second part. Marx's model of capitalism is a closed model. Closed not only in the sense that Rosa Luxemburg critiqued it, that is, she said it has only capitalists and workers, so there's a problem of realization of the surplus. Therefore, you need external markets. You cannot, it is not a logical complete system unless you bring in the colonies, the colonial markets, unless you bring in military expenditure, etc. So that is a very brilliant book Rosa Luxemburg wrote, The Accumulation of Capital. Absolutely correct, even though there may have been some technical mistakes in it. But subsequently, people who have studied Marx are very sincere. Marxists who call themselves Marxists in Europe had nothing to say on colonialism and imperialism at all, because Marx's own formal model of capitalism is within a closed system. There is no trade in it. Okay. Now, one wishes that Marx had not died when he did, because he died when he was not even 65, but he had stopped working for a couple of years before that because he was so sick. And between 1859 and when he stopped working, he only had 22 years of work left. 22 years is not enough. So he never even got started on the second part of his project on capital, on studying capitalism. But that doesn't mean that his successors should limit themselves to what was actually published in Capital. What his successors owe to Marx, if they call themselves Marxists, is to carry the project forward, which in a sense is what Lenin and Luxemburg did to a large extent. But of course, that project is incomplete. So it needs to be carried forward. And all the falsehood regarding the rise of industrial capitalism, about which I've tried to give you an indication, that has to be combated very vigorously. Okay, let me stop there now, and thank you very much for paying me so much attention.
So thanks, Professor Patnaik, for this excellent lecture. It was really illuminating to us, and we learned a lot. And of course, the references you referred during your talk by the participants for further study. And if you have any questions, please.
Please.
Sure. Hello, ma'am. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Hello, ma'am. Thank you. And I wanted to go.
I don't think your thing is working. Okay.
So I wanted to go back to the theory of ground rent, which you had talked about. So recently, I was reading about Kerala, and especially what EMS has had to say about the theory of ground rent, how he has applied it to the Indian context. So he says that he obviously differentiates and uses Skotsky to further the argument. And he says that he talks about the Marxist understanding of ground rent. And then he says that we need to apply it to the Indian context, and it serves as a justification for land reform, where if you have the absolute ground rent, which is paid to the landowner, and if you give it back to the peasant, then there is a possibility of reinvesting into the land, which is going to have some sort of a positive impact on the production side of the process, and maybe the peasant will be able to produce more. But empirically, we see that after the land reforms in Kerala, there was a very large chunk of the middle peasantry which comes up, and due to the wages also going up, as well as the speculation of land prices which comes up after the Gulf.
Due to what? Sorry?
Due to the wages of the agricultural workers rising due to unionization, as well as the land prices which rise due to speculation, we see that there's a squeeze of the middle peasantry, and in fact, paddy production goes down both in terms of the land area as well as the actual amount of paddy which is being cultivated. So if you could, because I was very confused as to how this can happen where you have ground rent going back to the peasantry, but you have the inverse outcome where production actually goes down. So if you can maybe talk about that a little bit.
Let me take a couple of questions and then answer together if there's any more.
There is a question in the classroom or maybe online, friends. Kindly raise your hand, online friends, or maybe in case you're unable to unmute, you can write it in the chat box also. Anyone here?
No?
Yet.
Thank you, Prof, for the lecture. Mine is a very simple question, I guess. So, almost all classical political economists assume exchange to happen at equivalent terms. Then you have unequal exchange coming up as a challenge to it. Now, where do we place unequal exchange in the set of logical fallacies? Is it a material fallacy or is it a formal? Is it a problem in the logic or the fact that they just didn't see the differences between the first world and the colonized of that thing?
Okay, so let me take these two. As far as paddy production going down, etc., is concerned, you mustn't forget that Kerala is a very major cash crops producing state. So I don't think paddy production going down has anything to do with land reform. It has to do with the fact that of the external demand and the specialization, increasing specialization of the land in cash crops like coffee and spices and so on, which traditionally Kerala has had, and which after independence maybe got intensified because there was a system of public procurement and distribution of food grains which was set up from 1965, which meant that after the Green Revolution, North India developed as the grain basket of India, from which the major part of the procurement took place. Punjab started with wheat, but then also produced more and more rice. So the major part of both grain, wheat procurement as well as rice procurement basically comes from North India. And then it is transported to other states which are recognized to be food grain deficit. Now, they're food grain deficit not because their land is infertile or because they had land reform. They're food grain deficit because they specialize. Their land is specialized in non-food crops. And Kerala is the prime example of that. So are the northeastern states. So is Kashmir. These are all food deficit areas. Okay? And because there was the public procurement and distribution system, and there was a food subsidy, what does the food subsidy actually do? Food subsidy is to cover the cost of storage and transportation of grain from the procuring areas to 2,000 miles away, to the border areas, to food deficit areas. So that in Kerala, you don't have to pay an exorbitantly high food price because you're specializing in cash crops. Okay? So I don't think it has anything at all to do with land reforms as such. But what happened after the neoliberal reform started from 1991 is that a part of the neoliberal reforms has to do with the attack on food procurement and distribution systems in developing countries by the advanced countries, because the advanced countries want to sell their food grains to us. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier. They simply cannot, they have a kind of very rigid output vector and a mismatch between their output vector and their domestic demand vector. Their domestic populations don't want to eat so much bread, dairy products, etc. So they have mountains of wheat and mountains of dairy products that they have to export. But they cannot diversify away from your wheat, etc., to tropical crops. They're incapable of doing that. because agriculture is different from industry. If it was a question of people in America demanding more shoes and less of cloth, they could produce more shoes, but you can't produce more coffee, you can't produce more spices, you can't produce more of any of the tropical crops that their populations demand. But they want access to the diversified productive capacity of our lands. Be very clear on that. And the entire attack on our agriculture is aimed at that. They want us to specialize in growing less grain for our own population, to import their surplus grain, to become importers of their surplus grain, and to devote more and more of our land to the crops that they need to fill their supermarket shelves for their well-to-do populations. It's very clear. And they have succeeded to a very large extent with a very large number of countries. Okay? So our public distribution system also came under attack. And it continues to be under attack, as a matter of fact. Now, if you look at the complaint that the US is making against India in the World Trade Organization, it's a completely ridiculous complaint. I don't know whether anybody has talked to you about this. Some people may have already told you about this. I've written about this. 2018, for example, the United States lodged a complaint with the WTO that India is actually giving forbidden price support to the extent of 2/3 of its value of wheat production and more than 70% of its value of rice production. Actual support India was given was negative. Has anybody talked to you about this? They have, yeah. So what is this? I mean, it is all to do with this completely dishonest fixing of a reference year for calculating support, which goes back to 1986 to 88. Taking the exchange rate of that year, taking the global wheat price in dollar terms of that year, converting that wheat price to Indian rupees, you get some 350 rupees per quintal for wheat. That is 3 rupees 50 paisa per kilogram for wheat. That is what they say you can give your farmers today, or at most 10% more than that, at most 35% paisa more than that. That is less than 4 rupees per kilo to your farmers, when the cost of production is 40 rupees per kilo in India. So this is, in fact, an illustration of the fact that dishonest theory and dishonest methods are being carried on to this day. And the principle I use always is whenever there's a particular argument which is coming from the government in northern countries or from conservative academics, or not even conservative academics, academics who purport to be concerned about slavery and so on, and colonialism, but who are hegemonized by conservative theory, I always assume that the theory is wrong, and where is it wrong? Pinpoint exactly where it's wrong. Okay? So now there's a problem. Now, because under the Manmohan Singh government, in fact, I was in Kerala at that time, because Prabhat was actually in the state planning board, vice chairman of the state planning board. And Manmohan Singh at that time was opening up the economy very fast. And there was also, because Kerala was being run by a left-front government, there was also, they were holding back the shipment of grain to Kerala, of rice to Kerala. The active discrimination by the center, which had never happened before. It had never happened before 1991. So then there was a problem. You had to increase your rice production, paddy production. So that became a problem only with the neoliberal reforms. It was not a problem earlier because you had grain being supplied through the public distribution system, and the food subsidy was covering the cost of transport. But this whole drive for increasing paddy production in Kerala started then. And of course, the situation had become quite acute by the time we went there, which was only in 2006, because there had been quite a considerable decline in paddy area and paddy production in Kerala. So obviously, you can't be dependent on a central government which is discriminating against you, which is not the case. So you have to try and increase grain production in Kerala as well. And some steps were taken at that time. I have not kept up with what has happened since 2011 in this respect. Unequal exchange. Now, you see, unequal exchange, Emmanuel's unequal exchange, I don't know whether you're talking about Emmanuel's theory particularly, specifically, is something that both Krishna Bharadwaj and I had criticized in two papers that we wrote in a seminar which was held a long time ago in the 1980s. And the two papers are there in a book edited by Prof. Patnaik called Lenin and Imperialism. I think that's the title, the collection of papers. Now, you see, at that time, there was really Emmanuel's theory, a lot of people latched on to because there was really no theory of how the advanced countries had exploited the developing countries and were continuing to do so. But the problem with Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange is that it is basically nothing but a globally blown up version of Marxist theory of exchange within a capitalist economy. So you are assuming complete mobility of capital and labor. You know, you are simply blowing up the idea that prices of production are lower than values in agriculture, higher than values in industry, etc. That idea, which is Marx developed in the context of a closed capitalist economy, we're trying to blow up on a global scale and talk about advanced countries and developing countries. That's not on. That is the logical problem with unequal exchange. Okay? Number one. Number two, the actual process through which advanced countries exploited today's developing countries was not understood and has not been understood by any of the people who have written on imperialism. They talk about slavery, they talk about exploitation of super exploitation of low wage labor in colonies like India. The entire mindset is focused only on the capital wage labor relation. But they cannot think of a situation, but the capital wage labor relation in the colonies covered only a very tiny fraction of the laboring population. Even at its height during the war boom, Second World War, there were hardly 2 million organized workers, probably less in India. It was hardly, a very tiny fraction of the total labor force. So they don't understand the fact that the actual method of exploitation was very different. The actual method of exploitation was to collect taxes. The taxes were mainly paid by millions of peasants and workers, and the collection of taxes in India started much earlier than anywhere else in any other tropical colony. It started from 1765, not from Plassey, not from 1757, but from 1765, when Clive acquired the Diwani of Bengal from the Mughal emperor, that is the right of collecting the revenue. That marks the real subordination. Because then what a trading company could do is that they could simply use the locally raised taxes to buy export goods. They no longer had to advance a single pound, a single penny of their own as traders to buy those goods. They simply used the locally raised taxes. Now, when the company handed over to the crown after the Great Rebellion of 1857-58, you think the British crown was going to give up on such a lucrative way of getting hold of tropical commodities without paying for it? They didn't have to pay for it. There was no, Britain had an enormous trade deficit vis-a-vis India on merchandise trade. Up to the 1840s, before Lancashire textiles starting pouring. So for something like 60 years, at least, they had a trade deficit, but they did not have to pay for it. It created no external payments liability because the producers of what they were importing had been paid already, so called paid, out of their own money, out of their own taxes. And actually, they were not paid at all, because the payment was coming out of their own money that they contributed as taxes. Just think about it. Get your mind around this. It was a diabolically clever arrangement. And it is an arrangement which no classical economist talks about. Not Adam Smith, not Ricardo, and no modern economist who's talking about empire talks about. There are any numbers of books on imperialism and empire. None of them had got that mechanism right. So through this mechanism, they were engaged. And I'm sure the French were doing the same in Indochina. The Dutch were definitely doing the same in Java, because Madison points out that, well, you just use your common sense. What demand would the Javanese have for Dutch goods? How much cheese would they eat? Or how many wooden shoes would they want to wear? And Netherlands simply did not produce anything that the Japanese would have wanted to consume. All right. They could not even force their manufacturers down Japanese throats. All right. So how did they get hold of so much imported goods? You go to the museum in Amsterdam. It's full of enormous cupboards from the 17th century onwards, made of tropical hardwoods, which they imported. The cupboards are very strange. They have huge bellies like that. They're like this, enormous, jutting out, because they had very voluminous clothing, so they needed this enormous cupboards to put them in. There are dozens and dozens of these cupboards. They, of course, consumed enormous amounts of tropical food grains and other tropical crops, fibers. They didn't pay for it. They got it free. The Dutch got it free from Java. Then in the 20th century, when there was a automobile boom, they started, got the Japanese to grow rubber. There was a huge boom in rubber tires for automobiles. The Java exported rubber at a phenomenal rate. They didn't pay for the rubber. They didn't pay for the cane sugar. How did they get it? They got it out of the taxes they collected locally. So they got it free. Similarly, the British got their goods free from India, and the French got their goods free from Indochina. This mechanism, which I have estimated from the statistical abstracts for British India for a period of more than 100 years, from the 1830s to 1947, you can estimate it. Once you know the conceptual, once you're clear about the conceptual basis, the data are there for the estimation. That has not been estimated by anybody. Our patriots like Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Dutt talked about the drain of wealth. They knew that there was something fishy going on, and the terms tribute to drain of wealth are not terms they invented. These terms which were used by the officials of the company themselves, which they took over. Officials like John Shore, who gave a memorandum to English Parliament saying that we are taking away so much as tribute. We're not paying them for their goods. We're taking away all this as tribute. This is lowering the income in our possessions in India, so they can't buy our goods. So it's a bad thing. So the officials of the East India Company were worried about the contraction of the market for English exports to India. That's why they were against the tribute, what they call the tribute, that we can't take away their goods without paying for them, as we are doing. So John Shore, then Richard Wingate, who set up the rivalry system in Bengal, saying the worst thing about our rule is the tribute that we take from the Indians. We take their goods without paying for them. Then, of course, Robert Montgomery Martin, who made an estimate of the drain, again taking the goods, value of goods that were taken away without payment, which were tax financed, used that for making an estimate of the drain. So they didn't use the term tribute and drain of wealth. It was not, Dadabhai Nauroji or Ramesh Dutt. They had these terms. But the mechanism of the drain was not clear to them once the British Crown took over. So the British Crown used a very clever method, which was not used before, which is an international bill of exchange, which I explained for those of you who read that chapter in Capital and Imperialism. It's a simple mechanism when you understand it. That is, the Secretary of State for India in the India office in London, he was a cabinet minister, the second most important minister in the English cabinet, said to foreign importers of Indian goods, you make your payment to me. whether you're Americans or Germans or whatever, you deposit your gold and the sterling value of your dollars and your marks and your francs and so on, deposit them to me. I will give you a bill which you send to the exporters from which you have imported in India. They can collect equivalent rupees from the exchange banks. Those equivalent rupees came out of the Indian budget, just as in the case of the East India Company, out of a special head called expenditure in England, and this was usually 30 to 40% of the entire budgetary expenditure. And all the data are there in the statistical abstracts. So you can make very precise estimates of what they took away. And it was enormous. So what was happening here was that the entire working population was getting exploited. The exporters were not being paid for their goods, but they were being paid out of taxes. Of course, the taxes were not collected only from the peasants and artisans who used to export goods. The taxes were being collected from the entire working population. If you collected it only from those who exported, those people would be dead. Because if they're not paid at all, you know. But what was happening is that the entire population was being underpaid. The entire export goods value was not being paid to the population. So it was extremely clever system. And the British economists, including John Maynard Keynes, were very careful not to give any inkling that this system was in operation. You read Keynes's Indian Currency and Finance. He actually fudges the accounts of the Secretary of State. He gives you the credit side and the debit side of the Secretary. He worked in the India office, you know. Keynes's first job was in the India office in London, under the Secretary of State for India. His first job, he joined when he was 23, left when he was 25. He joined Cambridge University as a teacher. He taught courses on Indian currency and finance to students in Cambridge University for many years. And then he was, because he wrote Indian Currency and Finance in 1913. And in that, he drew on his experience of working in the India office, that gives the debit side. On credit side, he does not declare credit. This is an international account. Real credit that the secretary was getting was all the foreign exchange and the gold he was earning from the world. It is condensed to the British. That's the real credit. He mentions only council bills. Value of council bills increased. Now, who knew what council bills were? Nobody knew. And why did the Secretary of State have why did he have a claim on the Indian budget at all? Why did he need a claim on Indian budget? What did he use it for? Not explained. Keynes knew well that the rich side should have been the foreign exchange and gold earnings of India that came into the Secretary of State. It doesn't mention that. Nowhere in the book. Right. And of course, our economists and our academics generally have a very attitude of veneration towards academics who are, well, Keynes was, I think he was the second most intelligent person of the 20th century in the humanities. He was an extremely brilliant person. But he was also a member of the British ruling class. And he knew when to keep quiet. There is nothing you can point to in the Indian currency and finance and say, this is wrong. This is incorrect. Because what they did was they did not give you the facts. They kept quiet. So it is through acts of omission that they misled people, not through acts of commission. There were no acts of commission. There's no sentence you can point to in cases this sentence is wrong. As I pointed to sentences in books, this is a incorrect sentence. Keynes was very clever. And the reason why at the age of 30, he was very young when he published Indian Currency and Finance. He was then put on practically every commission on Indian currency, 3 or 4 commissions. the people who actually looked after Indian finances. Why was he picked up? Because they must have appreciated his discretion. Here was very intelligent person. Don't talk about the real mechanism which underlay the trade of wealth. Even he knew about. And still he looked at the topic of the trade of wealth. That Keynes reviewed the economic transition in India. He reviewed that in Indonesia. The trade of wealth, that is not mentioned. Just 3 or 4 simple words. The four India's expense of the in London was intercepted, kept in London, or one sentence. One sentence would have been enough. That sentence you will not find anywhere. So the active obfuscation of the actual mechanism of the drain of wealth. All right. It's only when you look at the data, if you have the patience to go through 130 years of this statistical abstract, and you find this, expenditure in England, it's all there. The budgetary heads, expenditure within India, expenditure in England. All this was digitized by the University of Chicago. Whoever was digitizing was very puzzled. There's a question mark in one of the digitized things, which should not be there. It was put in by the person who was digitizing. Was very puzzled. What is this item expenditure in England? By the way, home charges was a term which was never used. You don't find it anywhere in the official documents, don't find it in the statistical abstracts. I don't know who first started using it, and what is a very cozy sounding term, home charges. But whose home? Certainly not the Indian's home. All right. So it was a kind of, English who ruled India kind of term. It's an unofficial term. It's not there anywhere in the officials. The official term is expenditure in England out of the Indian budget. That too is misleading because the expenditure in England was not in England. It was expenditure by England out of all the foreign exchange and gold they took away from India. And they did not allow it to come to India at all, either in physical form or as a credit, as an accounting credit. It was never credited to India at all. They intercepted and took all of it. Right? It was a very, very clever system. And the major part of the expenditure in England, 50% of it was interest on Indian debt. The debt also was artificially created, as we have discussed in our book, Capital and Imperialism. Only about 13% was, things like allowances for British officials by way of sterling allowances when they went back to England for their vacations and so on, for their leave. Only about 1/8 of the total expenditure was for that. All the rest was either interest on Indian debt, 50% by independence, or the rest was military expenditure incurred outside England. That is the expenditure of creating and maintaining an empire was paid for out of the foreign exchange earnings of colonies like India, which India was the largest, of course, but they also had Malaya, they had the Caribbean colonies. Now Trump is in trouble because he can't have transfers of that kind. It's not possible. So the whole face of imperialism, or the mechanism of the operation of imperialism now has changed, but it has not gone away. It uses new forms which have not been fully explored, which need to be, in fact, explored at all, and which need to be researched. Okay, I think we have probably overshot your usual.
Yes, it's been a fascinating lecture, but maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions last if there are any pressing questions. Online, it's been a little silent there. We'll give preference to the online.
Silenced my audience completely.
So maybe we'll give preference to online friends. Friends, if you have any question, this is the last chance. Meantime, if there is any question here. Oh, there is a hand. Yeah, Pranita, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Perfect.
Yeah. Hi, ma'am. I have two questions, but before that, let me just say I'm extremely happy that you finally came to give a lecture. I am a regular student, but sadly I cannot be there right now in person. Both my questions are regarding Marx, and let me just state at the outset that I have not read Capital yet. However, so the first question is that the recognition that capitalism is a demand constrained system. So as far as I understand, it is, I mean, based on whatever I've read so far, I mean, it is something that Marx came up with first. He was the first one to recognize that, right? However, there is a stream of thought within economics, including within heterodox economics, as I found out after after attending the lectures within this course, and including, lectures by Professor Prabhat Patnaik as well. And I mean, I even had a kind of like a discussion / argument about this with him. So when I asked him, so I mean, it is claimed that it was actually Keynes who came to this recognition. And of course, there's this whole Cambridge School thing of demand side that, you know, Marx only talked about the supply side of capitalism, and Keynes was the first one to talk about the demand side, you know, of the recurring crisis. And in fact, this is what, when I had asked like a couple of times this, I mean, during this course of one lecture, Professor Prabhat regarding this, so he said he also maintained that it was Keynes who was the first person to recognize that capitalism is a demand constrained system. And I mean he said something like that, so Marx just said that, oh, capitalism is prone to crises, it's prone to recurring crises, but he did not say that it happens on a, you know, the regularity of the recurring of crisis is not something that Marx pointed out, I mean, broadly speaking. So that is my first question. I mean, that's something I do, although as I said, I have not read Capital, but I have read like a bit of Marx and other things, and I do kind of feel strongly about it. So I would, because as far as I understand, Keynes was drawing from Marx. Of course, as you said, he was a brilliant guy. But anyway, so yeah, I would like your thoughts and opinion on that. And the second question I have, of course, I understand considerably less about it, which is basically, so I wish if you would please provide, like, I mean, if you could, basically the transformation problem in Marx. And I've heard a lot of lecturers and professors, including in this course, who have said, not all of them, I mean, but who have said that, okay, like the labor theory of value is, you know, useless because of the transformation problem. And so again, as I said, I mean, in this course, for example, we haven't really had a component of Marxist political economy as such. The only introduction we get to Marxian political economy is in an elective in the third semester, which is the political economy of development, which is taken by 3 brilliant, great professors. But apart from that, we've not really had any introduction to Marxian political economy in this course. It's also a feedback that I've given earlier. And of course, classical political economy as well. It's very, very basic. I think Professor Marcuse had taken one. So there is some introduction to that. But again, this transformation problem came up in her lecture also, because Professor Marcuse also said that, oh, you know, I mean, like all the concepts of Marx, like fetishization and all of that is fine, but, you know, ultimately the labor theory of value is unusable. And in this, I would just like to add, so recently I had heard a lecture by Professor Radhika Desai, and she mentioned, in fact, and I'm just paraphrasing what she said, because I don't, as I said, I don't myself fully understand this thing that I'm asking you. So she said that, so apparently the problem of transformation problem is a problem in Ricardo and not in Marx. And apparently, I mean, she claimed that it was Paul Sweezy who sort of made this confusion in the monthly review at some point, and that, and also there's the whole time factor. That time is not a element, a factor in when it comes to the labor theory, the labor value of the labor theory of value. You know, because I mean, it's period wise, it's discrete period wise. So anyway, I hope I'm like, I hope my question is clear. And pardon?
What's your name?
My name is Pranita, ma'am. Pranita. So I used to work in NewsClick, in fact, and I have met you before once, long ago in 2017.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I had also written to you, in fact, like if you could tell me some books to read, economics, and you did And of course, I haven't read all of them. I started in the first one, but you did mention at the end of the email that not to read neoclassical or Keynesian economics before Marxian economics. But I think, unfortunately, most of us, even in heterodox economics, get introduced to neoclassical and Keynesian economics before any introduction to Marxian political economy. So
Yes,
anyway,
yes, Pranita,
Thank you,
like
question, yeah.
Professor Patnaik. Yeah, yeah.
No,
Okay,
I
sorry.
don't think I put any kind of bar on anybody reading anything. You should read everything, absolutely everything under the sun in economics, every author. But all I have to say is that you should read some logic, because that is what I was not asked to read, and I regret it that I read logic so late in my life. And what the proposition I'm putting forward, which is not necessarily one which other economists will agree with at all. I think I'm the only one putting this proposition forward, is that most of economic theory is completely riddled with fallacies. And that is why I didn't want to take a course in the ideas certificate program, because I don't want to disillusion young minds, before you have to start a critique only after you've familiarized yourself with the discipline. You can't start with a critique before you've read anything. So read everything you can, but also read a book on logic. That was my message. And I didn't, or I either put a kind of, chronology that read this before that or anything like that. Not at all. I happened to start with Lenin and Marx, but that's because the books were lying around at home. My father was interested, he was an engineer, but he was interested in Marxist theory, oddly enough. I think a lot of people who in their youth went through the depression years got interested, in the whole theory of capitalism, crisis, and so on. So even though he was a mechanical engineer, he had all volumes of Capital, Lenin, and so on. So on hot summer afternoons, when I was still in school, I used to read. I don't know how much I understood. I didn't understand much, but I understood enough to say that, I must read this later on. So anyway, so I happen to start with that, but you can start with simpler expositions than plunging straight into Marxist capital.
You had asked me to start.
Just a minute. Let me answer your question.
Mhm.
One question was on demand-constrained economy, etc. You alleged that in an earlier lecture, Professor Prabhat Patnaik had said Keynes was the first person to talk about demand constraint. He was probably referring to first modern economists, because the whole question of Say's law was very extensively discussed by the classical economists long before Keynes. Marx himself rejected Say's law that supply creates its own demand in no uncertain terms. And if you want the history of ideas part of Marx, then you should read Theories of Surplus Value, which is in 3 volumes, where these are part of Marx's notebooks, where he looked through the theories of the people who went before him and who wrote on political economy. So Theories of Surplus Value has his notes and his remarks on all the people who preceded him. And he has very extensive comments on Adam Smith and David Ricardo also, on their theory of rent, on their theory of profit, and so on. So Marx never subscribed to Say's law. Let us be very clear. Now, Marx's method of abstraction is something economists are very familiar with. He believed in starting with what he thought was the simplest possible model and then introducing complications. And his method of abstraction is something his contemporaries did not understand, because in volume 1 of Capital, he starts with commodities exchanging according to their values. And then in volume 3, he says, no, they exchange at prices of production which deviate from values, which are not the same as values. So people like Baum Babak said, you see, there's a contradiction in Marx. He says one thing in volume 3, something else in volume. One thing in volume 1. No, he started what he thought was the simplest possible model, which is where commodities exchange according to values. And then he introduces complications. All right, he opens it up. And I believe that if he had lived for another 20 years in full possession of his faculties, then he would have opened up his closed model to discuss foreign trade and the world market, and he would have modified his entire model to take account of some of the things I've been talking about. He would definitely have spotted the logic, because if you read theories of surplus value, if you read Marx on Ricardo's theory of rent, Marx is absolutely scathing about the logical errors in Ricardo. But at the same time, he believed that Ricardo was a very honest academic. And when I published my critique of Ricardo's theory of trade, Professor Amir Bagchi, who passed away unfortunately only earlier this year, when he met me, said, "But Ricardo was an honest man." I said, Amir, whether Ricardo honestly put forward the wrong theory of trade, or whether he knowingly put forward the wrong theory, it makes no difference to the fact that it is wrong, and we'll never know. But Marx himself believed that Ricardo was a very honest person intellectually, and if he said something that was wrong, it's because he didn't know the facts, or that particular logical problem did not strike him. And he had never studied logic anyway. He never studied philosophy, he never studied logic. He was just extremely smart, but being very intelligent doesn't get you anywhere. You can be very intelligent and still make very elementary mistakes. Okay. So Marx would have opened up his model, but that is speculation because he passed away before he could do so. And before Keynes, in fact, Rosa Luxemburg was the person who has, again, a very scathing critique of Ricardo, because Ricardo believed in Say's law. Ricardo was the person who believed that a supply creates its own demand. So please read Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital. You'll enjoy it because quite a few chapters are again the theories of Rodbertus and others, Ricardo and so on, the people who went before her and before Marx. Quite a few chapters are descriptive when she brings in colonial exploitation. But of course, she wrote the Accumulation of Capital because she found a contradiction in Marx's reproduction schemes, and she said that you cannot have accumulation within a closed economy. You need external markets. So she was looking at the colonies in terms of markets. Now, what I've been talking about is that long before colonies became markets, their market role was important, of course. Long before they became markets, they were the sources of raw materials, essential raw materials and food for today's advanced economies. Today's advanced economies could not even produce the manufactured goods that they produced in the Industrial Revolution. Cotton textiles was the leading industry of the British Industrial Revolution. It could not have produced cotton textiles without importing, without paying for it. Raw cotton from the Caribbean colonies. The Caribbean colonies supplied unpaid raw cotton because it embodied slave rent. In the case of India, it was land rent, which was taken from peasants and then used to purchase the cotton. In the case of the Caribbean colonies, directly slave rent, again not paid for. So she emphasizes the market role, which came much later, which came at the time she was writing, or a little before, in fact, before that time, from the mid-19th century onwards. Whereas I start much earlier and talk about the resource providing role because of the asymmetric endowments of the tropical and subtropical areas compared to the advanced, which persists today, which was there long before there was capitalism, which is there after the Industrial Revolution, which is there today in the modern era as well, and which determines most of the economic policies that the advanced countries are following vis-a-vis the developing countries, and which is not recognized in the literature at all. Now, your second question was on the transformation. Yeah, so Keynes brings in the demand question, and he's the only one to do so in the modern era, from the stable of the ruling class or the establishment economists, because Keynes was a member of the British ruling class. He was not only a theoretical economist, but he was a hands-on person. He wrote an economic history as well. You read his treatise on money, the pure theory of money and the applied theory. There are two volumes, Pure Theory of Money and the Applied Theory of Money. In the applied theory of money, he has some amusing remarks about how the pyramids in Egypt were built and how Queen Elizabeth got a share of the loot that the pirates, English pirates, got from the Spaniards. And he capitalizes that her share and shows that if you capitalize at a certain rate of interest, that would account for the value of the gold that Britain held in modern times, or something like that, you know. So this capitalizing loot in order to arrive at the drain is what Keynes also did, but in relation to what the English pirates looted from the Spaniards. So read Treatise on Money. It's not as difficult as it sounds, particularly the volume which is the applied theory of money, as opposed to the pure theory. Pure theory, of course, the economics students should read, but I've always found the applied theory to be very interesting. So you see, Keynes was a genius because amongst all the people there, all the economists at that time, he is the only one who spotted the weakness of the theories about capitalism, that is, and of capitalism as a system, that it could not, it generated unemployment, it generated instability, and there was no way of dealing with it. And his way of dealing with it was through public expenditure, state expenditure. Of course, I have a little theory of my own. I don't think I'll live long enough to research it. And that is that Keynes's emphasis on the budget, on the enormous power of the budget, because after all, he was talking about public expenditure in terms of what the government could do out of the budget to reverse growing unemployment during the Depression. That his entire insight on that came from his interaction with the Indian economy when he was very young. Because that is what the British were doing in India in reverse. They were using the Indian budget to enrich themselves, to enrich the British economy, and to an enormous amount, to an unthinkable degree, you know, which has not been analyzed satisfactorily to date. So my next book is going to be on economic history. So I hope to be able to fill out in some detail what has been discussed very briefly in that chapter 13, no, not chapter 13, I think chapter 11 in Capital and Imperialism. Now, transformation problem, well, why get bogged down in the transformation problem? Because the whole problem why Marx did not have enough time to open up his economy is that he also got diverted to a certain extent by Ricardo's transformation problem. Now, I was supervised by Maurice Dobb, a very fine scholar and a Marxist, but of the traditional kind, who never talked about imperialism because he was he based himself on a textual understanding of Marxist capital. So Professor Maurice Dobb used to tell me about that you should not get into a bog. Now there is a Soviet historian, a very good historian, but he got into a bog of talking only about merchant capital and never got on to industrial capital. He spent his whole life only discussing merchant capitalism. So he called it the Pokrovsky bog. You don't get bogged down, you know. So there is a Ricardo bog, and the Ricardo bog is the transformation problem. Once you start with the transformation problem, you're finished. You can never get out of that bog, because at a theoretical level, it is very fascinating. But once you get into that, it takes up too much of your time and to no purpose. Now, Sraffa got into that bog. Sraffa essentially developed the Sraffa system, is basically trying to a Ricardian system. All right. And it's okay for Sraffa. He was a refugee from Italian fascism, took refuge in Cambridge University. He was not capable of lecturing. He had a block. He could not face a group of people like I'm doing. He could not talk to them. So Keynes said, okay, if you can't lecture, then you become the librarian. So Sraffa became the librarian at Cambridge University Library. And he was a fantastic person. He had first editions of the mercantilist writers' books. And when I was a student, graduate student, I actually got my degree from Oxford, but I spent some time in Cambridge because my husband had a job there. So then Sraffa allowed me, and he didn't allow very many people to do that. to actually go to his office, and he had these first editions of mercantilist writers from the 17th century. Not all first editions, some. He allowed me to look at them, annotated editions from that long ago, from 300 years earlier. Anyway, so Sraffa could devote his life to writing on basically a Ricardian book. But, we can't afford to do that. We have far more important things to deal with, all right? So you can't get bogged down in the transformation problem. I don't think anybody should even look at the transformation problem now. If Marx had avoided the Ricardo bog, then he might have got around to doing the second half of his project, which is opening up his closed system and looking at things that matter, global exchange, all the problems associated with it, and so on. Okay.
I think we're quite late in the day, but I hope there is no pressing question here, and maybe we can call it a day if there is no question. Is it? Okay, so maybe we can call it a day.
Yeah.
But then it's been fascinating to have you here and hear from you. We would like you to have to come again and maybe just jolt us to have critical thinking and look at things differently.
I
So
can
thank
come
you
and
so
talk
much.
to you about the estimation of poverty, if you like,
It would
because
be
that is an area
yes.
which I've written on, and my book has been with Tulika, and it's about. I was told that you'll get your book in 3 days' time, by the end of the month, so it should be available. So that is a critique that is not about economic history, really. It is a critique of the World Bank and the Planning Commission and the Chinese government's estimation of poverty. And it starts from 1973. So it's modern times, as it were. If you like, I can come and talk to you later.
Yes, yes, yes.
In
We
the
would love to have
semester.
you. Yes,
But
definitely.
no course, no series of lectures.
We understand. We understand that.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much, ma'am.
I
Thank you
don't
so
want
much.
you to. Okay. Whose coffee is this? All right. I don't mind having half a cup. You can heat that up. Yeah.